Welcome to the Core Outdoors podcast. My name is Christian Rawls. This episode is a conversation with Dawson Westeknsow. Dawson has spent the last 15 years working within the outdoor industry in product management roles at Thule, REI, and more recently at Oboz Footwear. Dawson is now working as an EOS implementer, and I wanted to have him on the show because I've seen firsthand how effective the EOS system can be for business owners. EOS stands for Entrepreneurial Operating System, and it provides a very clear framework to structure the operations of any business. This conversation sets a good foundation of understanding for EOS, and Dawson explains how it can be applied to businesses of any size. The aim of the Core Outdoors podcast is to provide actionable insights to entrepreneurs in the outdoor industry. The EOS system is a great framework for business owners, and I hope that this conversation with Dawson is helpful for you and your business. Dawson, thanks for joining me today. I really want to get into the EOS. I mean, that's the reason I wanted to have you on this show, is to really talk about the Entrepreneurial Operating System. But before we get there, I'd love to hear about how you found yourself in the outdoor industry and kind of the roles that you've had in the industry.
Yeah. So I would say I found product management in kind of an interesting way, really kind of through entrepreneurship. So I was in graduate school. The plan for me was always to start a business, really. And so I had a professor at the time, and he said, "Hey, I think you should check out product management." And so as sort of a training ground for entrepreneurship. So I essentially left school. I joined a power tool company, did sales for a few years, and then got into product management. And so I think what that experience taught me was that I love product management. You know, it kind of, in a lot of ways, scratched that entrepreneurial itch that I had, because you're sort of running a subpart of a business, right? You are seeing an idea, you're putting together a plan, and you're executing that business plan. So found that I loved that process. I didn't love working for a huge company, and I wasn't super passionate about power tools and construction, right? So with that, I decided I wanted to go in outdoor, and I got my chance working at Thule. And so I spent a couple of years at Thule. And again, that was a super entrepreneurial experience for me, because I was part of a team of 4 people. We were basically starting a totally new business, a totally new category for them, which was mobile handheld device cases. So we did everything from the business plan to the financials, to the marketing, to the strategy, to the channels, like all of these parts of the business, including kind of the design development. So did that, loved it. It was a fantastic experience. Then I had a chance to go to REI. At REI, obviously a huge company. Worked on the private brand side of the organization and helped them, redo the travel line and redid a few of the categories for them. And I kind of learned the retail side of the business. Again, great experience, but a really big company. And so the last company that I joined was a small footwear brand in Bozeman called Oboz Footwear. They were growing really quickly. And I moved to Bozeman, and I basically ran product for them for a couple of years, grew the business, actually was part of selling the business to Kathmandu. Stayed on for about a year after that, and to help them kind of transition. And so I guess that's sort of my product experience. After the experience with Oboz, I had a chance to just kind of step back and take a pause, I guess, after a pretty intense couple of years. I had a friend that was running an outdoor brand, and he didn't need a full-time person with my background, but he needed some product help. So I said, great, that sounds like fun. I started working part-time with him. And then I sort of figured out and realized that people called that fractional. And so I started working fractional and working for 2 or 3 different companies at a time, and actually did that for about the last 6 years. And so that's kind of the outdoor industry and product management part of my background.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've heard a lot lately. It seems like fractional positions kind of at the executive level has been a common thing. What is the benefit of having a fractional? Like, what is the role of I mean, you can have a fractional fill in the blank, CMO, CFO, anything. What are the benefits of having that fractional person in the business? And then from your side, what do you see as like the benefits to being that fractional person? That's kind of a big, broad question, but see where you can take it.
Yeah. So I think for me, what I observed, and I saw this at different companies at different times, was that typically people need product expertise before they can afford it. And so what they end up doing is they end up hiring somebody who, like, they promote someone internally, or they move someone over from marketing, and they sort of learn on the job, right? Because that's sort of the level of investment that they can afford, and that makes business sense. What fractional does is it gives you access to somebody who really has the expertise to grow the business, but you don't have the budget to essentially hire that person full time, right? So you can hire them for 10 hours a week, 15 hours a week. You put in a lot of the processes, and you get a lot of the strategic thinking that you're going to get with someone who has that level of experience, but you're able to pay, quite a bit less. And so you're able to get that experience earlier in the development of the business. And so I think that's, a lot of times I would say fractional CFOs and fractional like head of marketing are more common. The fractional head of product it's growing more in the tech side of things. I also saw it sort of being popularized on the tech side of the world, but outdoor has been a little bit slower to adopt it. So does that answer the question on that side of it?
Yeah. And how is it different than having like a contractor or a consultant drop in to be on the product? Like, you could hire somebody as a hired gun to be the product person.
Yeah. So the main difference is that when you're a consultant, you typically have you might be working on a specific project saying, hey, we need market research done in this area of the market. And so we want you to come in, do the research, and there's a deliverable and there's a set time frame around what you're doing, right? So it's a very specific, like discrete thing within the business as a consultant. When you're fractional, you're running the business. Like, you're working in the business, you're a member of the team, you're fully involved in everything that's going on. As a fractional head of product, I was typically on the leadership team. And so you're involved at that level of the organization, but you're tracking your hours. You have, what I would typically do is block out specific days, like maybe 2 days a week, you're 100% committed, or maybe, hey guys, my main office hours are 8 a.m. to noon these days during the week, but you're fully involved in the business. You're fully involved in the decision-making. And that's totally different than having a consultant who's kind of doing like one thing for a set specific period of time. There were definitely a handful of times where I started as more of a consultant, and then it evolved into more fractional, right? Because you're like doing one project, and then they say, hey, that project, great job. We love the strategy. Now we actually want to convert into more of a fractional relationship, where now you're just going to execute on the project that you just outlined as a specific project or a specific consulting engagement, if that makes sense.
Yeah, cool. And so somewhere along the way, you discovered EOS, or EOS discovered you. I don't know, but like,
that's right.
Because I really want to get into the EOS thing. So one question I'm just going to drop, and I'm just saying this out loud so we can get to it later, is like, how does fractional work in the EOS system? Does fractional work in the EOS system? So that's one. Get to it whenever you want to. I'm just putting that out there. But I'm really curious, like, where you came across EOS for the first time, and then we'll get into what the EOS is. But I'm just curious where you came across it.
Yeah, so I was working with a client, and this was a pretty long-term engagement. Again, I had started as a consultant, and then within 6 months, I was fully running the product function for them. They didn't really have a product team. And so this was like product strategy, marketing strategy. What does the team need to look like? How do we need to prune the assortment? What's the roadmap plan? Like, all of those types of things. And so that was great. The product team was coming together. We'd solved a lot of those issues. What I found was that even though the product function was working really well, the top level of the organization wasn't working as well. And so that was causing, that causes a bottleneck, and it causes issues in the business, right? And so in this company, it was actually a brother-sister duo that was running the company. The brother had founded the company. The sister was running the company. That caused problems. That's messy. That's complicated for anybody, right? And so I was sort of watching, fair amount of dysfunction, ambiguity in the business, and like really kind of hitting the ceiling as far as like, how do we actually grow this business, make decisions, keep people accountable, like all those types of small business questions. And they discovered EOS. And so it was actually the sister. She was particularly attracted to it because EOS has a unique model of having two leaders, where it has a visionary and an integrator. We can talk more about that, if you'd like later on. But the point is, that's what attracted them to EOS. And so as a member of the leadership team, again, I was fractional at the time. We worked with an implementer, and the implementer is now what I do. But this is someone who just helps you walk through the process and actually help you integrate the tools into your business, right? And so we worked with someone for a couple of years, and it transformed the company. It totally fixed, it doesn't fix all your problems. I like to say it fixes about 50% of your problems. 50% of your problems kind of fall into place and sort of solve themselves and kind of just go away. And then it gives you a framework for how to deal with the rest of the issues. And so I just saw it from the leadership team side of things. And so that's how I was introduced to EOS. I became such a fan. I became so convinced that EOS was incredible that I actually started to try and find more EOS run companies to work with as a fractional person outside of the outdoor industry, even though most of my career had been in the outdoor industry. So I worked with, in some cosmetics, I worked in some other consumer products, because these were companies that were already running on EOS. And I kind of had the confidence that those building blocks would already be in place. And so it just made it a totally different, experience. And so it was at that point that I said, I'm so convinced, I'm so bought into this. I actually want to be an implementer, and I actually want to help people on the other side implement EOS in their businesses. And so then about a year and a half ago, I started doing that. So I still do fractional, but I also actually help implement EOS. And that's kind of how I arrived. So your other question, I partially answered it, but the question was, does EOS work with fractional? And so I laid out the first time that I started using EOS, I actually was fractional, and I found that it worked really well. I think what EOS does, it works really well with fractionals. It also works really well with virtual teams. And the reason I say that is that EOS at its foundational root is really about organizing human energy and directing human energy. And so those can be challenging with fractionals and with virtual teams. It's already challenging, but it could be more challenging with those types of work setups. And so again, I've just found EOS is more powerful probably in those situations, because it makes everything so much more clear for everyone in the organization, so that everybody's marching in the same direction. So yeah, I actually think it works very well for those types of companies.
So maybe I should set the table a little bit more in the sense that, okay, EOS stands for Entrepreneurial Operating System. The gospel of EOS is a book called Traction by a guy named Gino Wickman. I came across it, I don't know exactly how long ago, but pretty much every entrepreneur that I've met since reading the book, I recommended at some point in my relationship with that person, like, hey, you should check it out, even if you don't implement it. And in the business I ran, we didn't implement the whole thing. We just implemented parts of it. But so yeah, EOS, I find it's funny, if you encounter EOS, you turn into like a multi-level marketer all of a sudden, because you're like, have you heard about EOS? Let me tell you about EOS.
You gotta try it.
I got something to sell you, which I don't have anything to sell you. Yeah. It's like, you got to try this. It's a miracle drug. And it is. It's funny because the people I know who run EOS or people who I don't even know, but I see online talk about EOS, it's all that whole, you said it, like 50% of your problems will go away. That is like a very common comment from people, is that like, we just started implementing it, and then all of a sudden that thing that was always, or those things that were always tripping us up, just don't even exist anymore. And so yeah, I've seen enough, and I know enough businesses who've run on EOS that now I'm like, okay, it ain't a joke. That's why I wanted to have you on here, because I think it's super helpful. Even if you don't feel like your business is at the size yet to run EOS, I say start running it earlier, because then it's just like guardrails that you can grow your business into. Okay, so that's EOS. How would you, we're using this phrase, but now there's all these like things inside of it how does it work? So my question to you is, how would you explain EOS? Like, you're sitting around the campfire with your friends who are not business owners. They're like, Dawson, what do you do exactly? And you got to explain EOS to them. What would you say?
So let me add a couple details around how EOS started. And so you mentioned Gino. What Gino didn't do was write Traction and put it out into the world and see if it worked. What Gino did is he was an entrepreneur, and he turned around the family business. For example, he started a few different businesses. He worked with a lot of, I don't know if you've heard of Young Entrepreneur Organization. There's a few of those types of organizations that he worked with. And he saw these common problems, regardless of industry, across company sizes. And what he found was that there were these tools. He started to put together these tools and found that the tools worked in all these different scenarios, right? So one of the things I like to tell people about EOS is that it's a proven system in that there's nothing magical. When you hear about the details of it, you're not like, oh, this is totally mind-blowing. They're just simple, proven pieces that when put together across the business are just really, really powerful. And so that's sort of what he discovered. As he started sharing this with other people, he said, how can I get this out to more people? He then wrote Traction. So it was already a proven system that he had sort of, pressure tested with a lot of different companies. And then he wrote the book. So I tell people within Traction and within EOS, there's 3 things that we focus on, and then we'll get into maybe a few of the details. But at its basic level, we do 3 things. The first is we help a company establish the vision. And this is just getting everybody on the same page with exactly where you're going as a company and how you're going to get there. Many entrepreneurs think that this is very clear, when in reality, it's not as clear as they think, right? So a lot of issues go back to that it's not a lack of vision, it's a lack of clear vision, clearly communicated, and totally aligned across the organization, right? The second thing we do is we help you get traction. And so traction is really about the discipline and accountability. So we have several tools that we use that when you implement them, it just sort of drives that accountability in the organization, speeds up decision-making, speeds up problem solving, but it just helps you, has a system to help you add those things to your business. And then the last is what we call healthy. And by healthy, I just mean a healthy team. Teams that are free of politics. You can disagree and have robust debate, and you build a really high trust, high functioning team, and especially leadership team. So those are kind of the 3 areas that we focus on. I'll jump into the model next, but any questions or thoughts about any of those?
No, I think that's good. I mean, the thing that I really plucked out of EOS and reading the book was the vision part of it. Like that to me, and let's talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, to me, that's the thing. Is even if you're a company of 2, the vision part it can be like pretty life-changing.
Yeah. Yeah. And essentially, and I'll answer that question first, is another common question is, what size companies does this actually work for? We say between 10 and 250. There are certainly people who are smaller companies. I've worked with solopreneurs who are building a business who start implementing the tools of EOS early on because it gives them a roadmap and it gives them a strong foundation. There's also a lot of private equity companies who require that as part of, like, if we're going to invest in you, you're just going to use this system. So I definitely hear a lot more about that. But, ultimately, at the foundation of EOS, it's really about simplifying your business. And so this is kind of the way that I describe it. When you run the business, it feels a little bit like whack-a-mole, right? You're constantly putting out fires, issues pop up, you're running around trying to solve them. You make one go away, and as soon as you make one go away, another one pops up, right? This is just the way it feels. EOS takes the approach of saying, if you break your business down into 6 areas, what we call 6 key components, and if you're able to strengthen each one of those components, and the tools of EOS are how we strengthen those 6 key components, but as you strengthen each one of those, then again, 50% of your issues solve themselves. They just kind of go away. And then EOS gives you a process for working through the rest of the issues. So what are the components? You've mentioned one of them, and it's the one we start with, which is vision. And so vision is really just about where you're going as a company and how you're going to get there. A really, really powerful tool that we use. It's free, something you can download on the EOS website called the VTO, which is the Vision Traction Organizer. It just has 8 questions. You walk through the 8 questions, and these give you alignment as far as what you're trying to accomplish as a business It starts at a 10-year target, breaks it down to a 3-year picture, a 1-year plan, eventually 90-day, what we call rocks. There's some other components within that BTO, but the point of that tool is it's really intended to help you strengthen your vision, and it's crystal clear. It's black and white. It's super transparent across the whole organization. So we start with we start with vision. The second component is what we call people. And people is really about getting all the right people in all the right seats. So we got to help define what the right person in your organization is, because it's different for every company. Then we got to step back and create the right structure. And then we got to make sure you got that combination, right people, right seats. The third component is data. And data is really simply, when you start a business, it's a lot gut feel, it's a lot intuition, it's a lot of, emotion of just kind of trying to figure out how to make the business work. But as you start to grow, you got to move beyond that and make really data-based decisions. And so we establish a couple tools. We help you get the data in front of you. So it helps drive decision-making. What we find is that vision, people, data, you get those three parts humming pretty well. Again, that solves a lot of your issues. The issues that are left are super clear. It becomes obvious what those issues are, okay? So the fourth component in the model is issues. And issues is really about getting all of the issues out on the table. We help you with an issues list, which just means you get all the issues out of everyone's head, and they're just visible for everyone to see. There's no shame in pointing out an issue, right? It's just an issue on the board, and we just solve it.
Can you define what an issue would be, or give some examples of some issues? I mean, they don't have to be specific to a certain business, but just broadly issues.
Yeah, I mean, there's issues. There's what I like to call leafy issues and root issues. Part of what we do in the US is we try and we establish the habit. Leafy issues are things that pop up, you solve them, but then you're going to solve the same issue next week and the week after and the week after, right? As an example, an issue might be, hey, we're late on an order to the factory because the packaging isn't done. That's an issue. This is a problem. How do we solve it? So the leafy way to solve it is to say, okay, well, Jim just didn't send the file, right? So someone's got to talk to Jim. They got to get him to send the file, and then we'll be back on track, right? That's the leafy issue. What we try and do in this component is you got to establish and really build the muscle of getting to the root cause. So why is that issue happen? Is it that the process isn't clear? Is it that they don't have the tools to do the work? Is it that we have the wrong person in the wrong seat because they don't even know how to do packaging? Not typically the case, but the point is, how do you dig down and really get to the root so that as you're solving these issues, they go away? The goal is not to solve them every week. The goal is to identify the issue at the root, figure out how to solve it, make it go away forever. And that's really what this issues component is about. Identifying those issues, getting really good at prioritizing them, because there's always too many, and then solve them at the root, right? And so that's what we try and do in strengthening that issues component. But issues, to get back to your previous question, issues are anything that are causing problems. They can be, hey, I keep talking to Jane in marketing, and man, she is snippy. Every time I ask her for something, it's like that's a problem. It can be an issue of sales. We're not hitting our sales number for this month. It can be, we have a quality issue at the factory. How do we deal with this, right? All of these things that come up in the day-to-day of every business, but it's just getting them on a list. It's not a problem. It's just something we got to work on and solve, right? And that's a bit of a culture shift for most companies, honestly. So yeah, did you have a question? Sorry.
I was going to ask, it's a huge question, but it's how do you continuously work through those issues, in the sense that do you implement the EOS system, and as issues continue to rise, you just deal with them, and then magically over time, the issues list just gets smaller and smaller and smaller until you're just dealing with a handful of issues kind of as they come, but you've dealt with all the bigger ones, and you learned how to build the muscle to solve the issues. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Business is always whack-a-mole at some extent. So long-term, do you ever get rid of the issues, or is you just get really good at solving issues quickly?
So I'll go back to my product management role, and product management is really hard when you first start. Part of the reason people burn out or don't make it as a product manager is because they constantly feel like there's so many problems that they can't solve, right? So when you're a really good product manager, you understand that there are always more issues than you can possibly solve. And your job is not to solve all the issues, because issues are inevitable when you're making product. And the reality is they're inevitable in other parts of the business as well. But like, there's always problems. There's always things that pop up. There's always unexpected challenges, right? And so it's not about never having issues. It's about getting really good at prioritizing what's the most important and then solving them in a way that makes them go away forever. Because again, if you're whack-a-mole, if you're solving them at the leafy part of the problem, it just comes up again. Jim he's always late on getting the packaging designs, right? So it's just like, we're going to deal with it in 3 more months during the next seasonal, that part of the calendar. So it's really about making sure that you're honest, because another part of what's challenged here is that if you don't get all the issues on the list, they don't get solved. So if there's a big hairy issue that's the elephant in the room and nobody's willing to say it, this gets back to healthy teams. Like, if you don't have a healthy enough team that you can say, hey, leader, you're stepping on my toes every day. I feel like you don't trust me. I feel like you're always in my business and hanging over my shoulder, right? Or the leader is saying, every time I see what you're doing, I'm just not confident in your decision making. So I don't feel comfortable. So I feel like I have to micromanage you, right? Like, those issues have to be stated, and you got to get them on the list or they're not going to be solved. And that's hard for people. So to get back to your question, the issues list never goes away, and that's really not the goal. The goal, and I'll talk a little bit more about this on the traction side, but the goal is really about a culture of getting them out on the table and then having a process for getting really good at prioritizing them and solving them at the root. But you're always going to have issues added to the list. If you don't, then you're not. I always tell people it's everyone's responsibility to get issues on the list, because we're running into the issues. You just got to be honest and upfront about getting them out on the table. And that's part of what EOS helps you do, because that's hard to do, right? Not every team has like a high trust environment where you can say those things and bring those things out on the table. So it's a little bit of that part. But again, getting them out on the table, prioritizing them, solving them at the root, that's really kind of I would say the main part of that issues component. And that's a big one, because again, issues never go away. So you got to really build that muscle in the organization. The fifth component is what we call process. Everybody, hates talking about process. At the end of the day, what you don't want is a 1,000-page process manual for every detail of how you run your business. And so EOS is really about getting the most important parts documented. And so you have like the key drivers of the business documented in a way that help you grow the business, makes it easier to manage. That's kind of that process component. And then the last one is traction. And so we talked about vision. Vision's the high level, long-term, where we go and how we're going to get there. Traction is like the day in and day out, rubber hits the road execution of the business. And so we have a few tools for helping you do that. One of those is a meeting cadence, right? And so how do you use this issues list in your business to keep it front of mind and make it a part of what you're doing on a regular basis as a leadership team and as a company? And so that's part of that traction, is it sort of embeds some of those practices into the company, if that makes sense. So that's the model. What I always tell people is the magic of EOS isn't any one of these individual tools, because, so let's say you download that VTO, which I would highly recommend that everybody do. Fill out the tool. It's really, really powerful. But if everybody's 100% dialed on the vision, but the other components are weak, then your business isn't going to excel. You're going to struggle. So the magic is really, how do you make progress in all of those different components at the same time? It's a little bit like a ratchet, right? How do you work on all those consecutively, little by little, so that you kind of tighten everything up? And that's really where the power of EOS is. And that's where you see the biggest results as you kind of go through the process.
And when, in your experience of whether it's the first time you came across EOS working for the brother sister entrepreneurs, or maybe later. I'm just curious, in your experience, where do you find that companies bump into the hard parts of the implementation of bringing EOS? Like, is there kind of a common, like, ooh, every time we hit this one, or I know every business is different, but are there some kind of common trends where people get tripped up?
I think where people get tripped up, you mentioned when you were running on EOS, you did what you call the self-implementation, right? Which is that you read traction, you pulled a couple of the tools out, and again, that's where a lot of people start. And if you do that, you're going to get some benefit, right? I think where people struggle, because it's just really hard, is how do you attack all of it kind of at the same time in a way that gets that flywheel momentum right across all of the 6 components. I think that's the biggest challenge, especially if you're self-implementing, is to because you really need someone, even if you're not using an implementer, I always recommend you kind of need someone who is dedicated to like being the EOS person in the business, especially during that first 6 to 12 months. Okay. So I think that's a challenge. The other thing that I think that we do early in the process is something that's called the accountability chart. And again, the accountability chart is the tool that we use to really try and get the right people in the right seats. And typically, there are problems, right? When you map it out and you really go through it and you're really being honest, almost always you identify either a right person in the wrong seat, which is someone that like, man, everyone loves, they're such a good fit for the organization, but they're not really doing exactly what we need them to do, right? Like they're kind of holding up the business. Or you get the wrong person in the right seat, which is that they're really, really productive. They're great at what they do, but they're just not a good fit for the company. Like they don't fit with the core values, and that's a problem too, right? So you inevitably find a few of those, and you're dealing with real people and you're dealing with, sensitive issues. And so a lot of times it takes people some time to sort of really come to terms with what the reality of those situations are. And then it takes time to work through them in a way that's fair and, helps people evolve and move forward and step up to the plate when you're asking them to step up to the plate in a different way than maybe you've done in the past. But very, very important. And we do it at the beginning. And so many of the issues of the company come back to that piece, in my experience.
What have been some success stories or just like one success story of, pre-EOS, this is what the business looked like, post-EOS, this is what the business looked like, kind of in that people in the seat situation?
Well, I'll give you an example. I got a call from a client 2 weeks ago, and they've done the first 3 foundational sessions, and I think we did the first quarterly. And so the person who is the visionary of the company, he identified that he was the visionary through the process. He took his first vacation since starting EOS. So he called me up and said, I went to Virginia for a week. I was really nervous. I got back and kind of was like, hey guys, what's going on? Like, we got to get all these things rolling. Remember what we talked about at EOS? Like, what are our rocks? And he said, and everything was done. Everything was being handled. People were doing what they knew what they needed to do, and they were doing it. And he said he was just totally blown away by that experience. And I would say that is pretty typical. Within the first 90 days.
Yeah, it's super hard, right? That's the hard. Yeah, sorry. I was just say that's a hard part about small business or medium business. It's like the entrepreneur, the founder feels locked to it, right? And if you step away for a minute, that something's going to go. I mean, there's also trust issues and control issues that may come along with that too. But the nice thing is with EOS,
totally,
you can relinquish it with confidence.
Yeah, and all that takes time, right? None of that is fixed one day to the next. But I would say that's a pretty typical situation where because again, what I've found, and you as a founder, I'd love to hear your experience with this, but what ends up happening is, the company's growing, things are happening, all of a sudden you've got double the people that you had before. And like the entrepreneur wants to have a company that just knows what to do and does it. That's their desire. That's what they want. But they haven't quite figured out how to trust people or to build the system to help them do that. And so they end up doing the opposite of what they want, which is becoming the bottleneck, having all the decisions come back to them. And they can't quite figure out why that is. Right? But that's very, very typical. And again, EOS is the thing that's so fun about EOS, to jump back to the fractional side for just a second. Like fractional is like you're in the business and I'm telling you, this is the strategy you should execute on. These are the products that you need to prune. This is what you need to develop. This needs to be your marketing strategy. Like I'm telling you those things, right? EOS doesn't tell you any of those things. It doesn't answer those questions for you. But what it does is it takes the other side, which is all the stuff we're talking about, the trust, the accountability, kind of the basic, a little bit of the hidden stuff that you don't really talk about that much, but you just plug in and you use it and it works and it solves 50% of your problems. And then you can really focus on the hard part that's unique to your business, which is the brand, the product, the strategy, all of that side of it. And it kind of eliminates some of those other parts that you've probably never you've thought about a few of them, but you haven't thought about all of them as one package, if that makes sense. So in a lot of ways, it's almost like the flip side of that coin. You just plug into the system and it just starts working.
Yeah. I texted a few friends that run on EOS yesterday and prepped for this conversation. Just, curious, like what they had to say about it. And one of them sent me this perfect one-liner. I mean, there was more to it than just this one line, but this one line stood out to me. He said, it's a clear system can create more time and freedom for creativity. And that's what he's experienced in his business, is that now they have a clear system of like, this is how it operates. And they've created a ton more time and opportunities to be creative. Because at first, when you bring in a framework like EOS, the founder may be like, God, yes, this is what we need. The vision, I need this. And the employees could be like, oh my God, this is so corporate. Why are we doing this? But the end result is like life gets better for everybody. And then you actually have more time to be creative in the role that who doesn't want that? Like who doesn't want more time to be creative?
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. The other thing that from a founder perspective, I think, and from employee perspective, and having gone through a few acquisitions in my career, I think one of the things that I've seen the founder so wants, right? They're going from a place of like, I built this business, blood, sweat, and tears. This thing is part of me. And then all of a sudden they're selling the business and they feel a little bit like in a free fall because they're like, I want this thing to continue in the way that I built it, but they don't quite know exactly how to do that, right? And then the employees are sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, we're losing our North Star in the company. Everything's going to be different. Like, who are we anymore, right? Like these are all the things that go on internally for individuals and for companies. That's also one of the really cool things about EOS is it also, I found it's a framework for, in a lot of ways, helping a founder like really distill those parts of themselves into the business in a way that's like becomes the business and not just their own personality, right? And people in the business, it also, again, they sort of feel this comfort in, okay, like I see where we're going. I see how we're going to get there. I see how this is part of this vision that this person that I've been following on a mission for the last 10 years, building this thing together. Now I kind of see how it fits in. And that to me is also huge and is pretty cool to see.
You mentioned something a second ago. We've talked about it a couple of times, the idea of like the visionary for the business. And then there's an integrator. Just briefly, just describe kind of those two roles and how they play into the system.
Yeah. So the visionary is typically the person who has 1,000 different ideas. They're always running it, really high level in the organization. They show up to the meeting They say, we got to do this, 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 and this. And then the team says, how the heck are we going to execute on that? We're already doing 50 different projects. How are we going to do that too? And then a lot of projects kind of fall on the floor. And so what happens is the visionary is like, why doesn't my team get it? Like, I've got this great vision, I've got this great plan and all these ideas, and no one's executing on them. And the team's like, dude, where are we even going? It just seems like, we're spinning around in circles, right? And so part of what EOS does, if you have a visionary, you essentially have to call that out in the organization. You got to make it really clear that that's their seat. There's a visionary. The visionary does some different things, and you got to clearly outline what those roles are. And then the other leader that you bring in is the integrator. The integrator is the nuts and bolts decision maker on the ground, running the business day to day, and they need to be the yin of the visionary's yang, right? Like, they need to work together in a way that's really complementary, with what their roles are very, very well defined. And what that allows for is, it allows the visionary to do visionary things, and then it allows the integrator to do integrator things, like really just running the day-to-day business. And again, it turns a situation that can be really difficult for the team and for the two leaders, and it turns it into a superpower, because the people are leveraging what they are really good at in a way that helps the business grow. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How does it work when you have a smaller business with, let's call founder/CEO? They've kind of always been the visionary. When you're going to implement EOS, how do you bring that in? Does every organization always have the integrator, or do you have to retrain somebody to be an integrator? Do you go find and hire can you bring in a fractional integrator? How does that work if you're just kind of running on this kind of CEO founder model for a long time?
So what I would say is, most companies of this size, and when I say this size, let's say less than 100 million, most have a visionary and an integrator. Not everybody does. There's a very few founders who are like, they really can do everything, even as the company grows. There's just not that many of them, right? So most of the time, there's a need for both. Part of what we do with the accountability chart is, it helps you look out into the future, and you say, this is what the company needs to look like 6 to 12 months. So it's like a little bit of a future looking plan. Okay. So in that situation, you can have one person who sits in multiple seats. So if you're really small, you might say, listen, I know I'm a visionary. Right now, I got to do both, but by going through this process, I understand that there's a difference between the integrator and the visionary. And I understand that in order for my business to really grow, I have to lean into what I'm the best at, which is to be the visionary, right? So what it does is, it creates a plan for what you need to do as the business grows. And you say, okay, now I know at XYZ point in the business that I need to hire, and maybe that's promote from within, maybe that's bring someone from the outside, but it makes it clear that this is something that needs to be solved maybe within the next 12 months, even if it doesn't happen immediately. And so again, you might have someone who sits in both of those seats for a period of time, but then you have a plan for how to get in the best case scenario, which is that you have both. Another example of that is, I'm working with a company who has a visionary and integrator. It's worked extremely well. The integrator is now leaving. And so when that happens, it throws things into a bit of flux, right? And so the integrator work still needs to be done. And so you can handle that in a multitude of different ways. But again, it makes it very clear, like, this is a gap. This is an issue. To get back to the issues thing, this is something we need to solve for, right? And so that's the first thing I would say. As far as fractional integrators are very common. And so you definitely can hire a fractional integrator as a young company who's saying, okay, I'm ready. And maybe that's a first step, right? Is to say, we're not big enough to get a full-time integrator. We're going to bring a fractional in, and then you sort of see how that plays out. And it can be part of a plan to grow into, being in a position where you're ready to make a full-time hire in that seat. And that's dependent on the business, right? So.
Yeah, and I recognize that we're a couple of disciples talking about the gospel here. So we're both believers in the
Yeah.
system. So I guess maybe we should address a few, or maybe the potential people who are like, yeah, that sounds too corporate for me. Like, what do you say to people who are like, yeah, that's just too much structure for my little business. You're going to squash our creativity.
Yeah. I think I would say exactly what you said, right? Which is, and I'll take a step back maybe on going back to the world of product management, because inevitably you work with a lot of visionaries. I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know they were visionaries as I was running these product functions, but they would, what they want is they want the product to be created in a regular fashion, right? Like a regular execution of product, but then be able to immediately respond to any opportunity that comes up. Hey, we need to custom this. Hey, I want this. Hey, this buyer asked for this. Drop everything, right? So that's a challenge. And a lot of product people who are listening to this are like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. So one of the things I've always tried to frame with visionaries when I was in the product seat was saying, hey, listen, our goal is to be 80% structured so that we can execute on the 20% of the most important ad hoc opportunities, right? If there's no structure, you never get anything accomplished. And again, product people are going to be nodding, because if you don't have some guardrails and some structure and some process, then things just fall apart. Things spin endlessly. If you could formalize that 75 to 80% of the business of the product development process, then it's like, hey, this is what we're doing. It fits into this bucket. It's a regular part of how we go about growing the business. If you do that, then you can save space for the 20%. And then it's like, hey, we have this thing that we really need to execute on. Okay, we can't do that for 10 projects, but this is really important. You're right. Let's hit this one out of the park, because this fits into that 20% of like flexibility. And I would use the same example with EOS, where if you don't always want to be dealing with people issues, then you need some structures and some systems and some things to help you automate that, so that you can do the stuff you really want, which is product and strategy and marketing. At least that's what I love doing, right? So if I was talking to myself, I guess, as a founder, that's what I'd be saying to myself is just plug into this thing that fixes a lot of the stuff that you don't really want to deal with, even if it feels a bit too structured, so that you can really lean into the stuff that's hard and unique and different for every business and is totally customized, right? And so I think that's part of it. And I would also, I guess maybe as a second part, lean into this idea that EOS as a system helps you perpetuate yourself into the future as a founder in a way that's really hard to do on your own. Because again, you're trying to build something that like has these aspects of you and your vision that are ingrained. And you use EOS, you plug in, you set it up in the way that EOS outlines, and then whether if you get hit by a bus, everything is set. You retire, you sell the business, whatever. It sort of is an important part of that transition from the business is you to the business is a business that kind of can continue to grow and evolve, but in a way that you have control of if you take control of it early enough in the journey.
That's exactly what I was thinking about when you were talking, is that this idea that, I mean, you mentioned it earlier about private equity companies saying, hey, yeah, we'll invest in you. Here's EOS. You got to use it. There's a company based out of private equity based out of Victoria here in BC called Tiny Capital. And they just bought AeroPress a few months ago. And anyway, they really successful business. And they just started to implement EOS across where they're trying to implement EOS across a bunch of their businesses. My thought is, if you want to sell your business, if you want to take on investment, if you want to just sell your business to your employees, EOS makes the most sense, because you're like building this framework that's totally transferable, which removes a ton of potential risk from the eyes of a potential investor or buyer. So yeah, boy, it really sounds like we're selling EOS here. So I will, one last, but I mean, that's why, hey, it's not my podcast, but I wanted to have you on because I'm such a believer in this and I want people to know more about it because I think, yeah, it can really, really shape businesses, small businesses just getting started. So I guess that's maybe to land the plane a little bit here. So somebody goes and buys Traction. I recommended Traction to a small business a couple weeks ago. I meet with them regularly. They've read it. They're like fired up, ready to implement it on their 4-person team. What would you say is kind of the next steps for a small, let's say you're not ready quite yet to pull in an implementer, but you're read Traction, you understand the basics. Like, what do you think the next steps are for somebody who's going to try to do a little bit of self-implementation?
Yeah, I was actually just having a conversation with someone about this yesterday, and I've got Traction sitting here on my desk, and I was reminded that the last chapter of Traction is called Getting Started. And it actually does a great job of, like, if you're a self-implementer, you're trying to test the waters, you're trying to figure out if it makes sense for your business, that last chapter just outlines exactly how to implement it and the tools to start using first and kind of how to roll that out. And I would just recommend reading that chapter. There's another book that is called What the Heck is EOS? And it's basically just, if you don't have the stomach for the 300 pages or 250 pages of Traction, you're going to get it's just a boiled down version, right? And so that's another tool for people if you're just trying to learn more and kind of wrap your head around it. Or maybe if you read Traction and you're like, I don't have another month, so I'm going to go through and read What the Heck is EOS because it's faster and it's sort of like, okay, I'm really going to internalize these tools and put together a plan for how to roll it out. So honestly, that's what I'd recommend. And then just take one at a time and start working through the tools. One of the other things you mentioned, and I'll mention this, one of the things I love about being an implementer is I actually don't have to sell EOS. Like that's what I love about it. I don't sell EOS. I just talk to people about it. That's all I do. And I talk to people about it. I answer questions. And as they ask me questions about their business, I'm able to help them with tools. And the reality is that sells itself, which is fun, which is a ton of fun. So that's, I think, what I would recommend for people. I'm a resource. I'm here. Feel free to reach out. Again, I talk to people all day, every day about EOS. And so feel free to reach out and ask any questions. I have been amazed how many more and more I'm uncovering outdoor companies that are using EOS. And so it seems like every week I discover a new one. They're out there. I'm starting to make connections between those people to sort of try and build a bit more of like an outdoor EOS community, which I really want to help be a part of and like help facilitate. And so again, even if you're just interested in that, hey, let's connect and we can start kind of putting together some connective tissue across people who see value in this type of a system. And it gives people a support network as they're trying to use the tools.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, some type of shared community of EOS people in the outdoor would be amazing. I'm going to link to your website and your LinkedIn handle and all those things in the show notes. So for those listening who want to get in touch with Dawson, it's in your podcast app. His link to website and all that stuff is in there. How long, and we'll just end with this question, is like, how long do you think it takes to implement a full EOS system into a business?
So if you work with an implementer like me, we have it's a proven process for how to implement it. Okay. So what that looks like at a high level is we have 3 foundational sessions we do over 90 days. And those help get you sort of the basics and like the core, most important tools in your business. Okay. If you continue to work with someone after that, which most do, then we would meet together on a quarterly and a 2-day annual planning session. That's kind of how the cadence works. So typically what happens is you start working with someone, you go through that 90 days, you get really solid on kind of the core tools. Then you continue, and every quarter as we meet, we implement a new tool. Okay. Normally you work with an implementer for about 2 years. So sometimes more, sometimes less, totally depends. The intent when you're working with an implementer is to make you the expert, ingrain them in the business so that I'm not working in the business telling you how to use it. I'm just giving you the tools and helping you make them part of your business. So there are people that work with an implementer longer because they like having a third person, third party kind of outside the organization, but 2 years is average.
Okay. Makes sense. It's worth investment of time and money or whatever it takes for you to do it. I lied. That wasn't our last question because it wouldn't be a full podcast unless I ask you the question I ask everybody in this podcast, and it's going to hit you as a surprise because we didn't talk about it beforehand. But how do you define success for yourself?
So one of the things that I do personally is, again, I'm such a believer in EOS. I use it personally. Like, I don't just use it as a business owner. I don't just talk to people about it all day. I use it personally. And so part of that is I have personal core values. I have a 10-year target. I have all of these. Again, it's my vision. It's my personal individual vision for where I'm going and how I'm going to get there. So for me, I'll just tell you my first core value is freedom for myself, for my family, and for those I associate with. It's my number one core value. And so for me, that encapsulates a lot of different things, but success for me is being able to do what you love with people you love, making enough money so that you can do those things that you want to from a professional standpoint and kind of have the most enriching, opportunity to do what you want on a daily basis. It lines up with EOS because we've talked about some of the founders and kind of what EOS does for people. It helps them find freedom, helps them build better businesses, ultimately live a better life because they're fixing some of the issues that are maybe holding them back or, causing them to not have as much freedom as they'd like. And so that's success for me, honestly, is freedom for myself, getting to do what I love every day and helping other people find that same freedom for themselves in whatever way that manifests in their life, because it's different for everybody.
That's awesome. I love it. Well, I wish you more of it. And I agree. I use a VTO sheet for myself for my own life as well. So we're
awesome.
Cup in the same cloth. Look at this. Totally disciples here. I'm just going to add as you close, like for people like you and me, freedom also means time to go fly fishing whenever you can.
100%. Yep.
Yeah. You live in a good spot for that.
Yeah. It's not a bad spot. And I don't even know if we mentioned this, but I'm in Bozeman. And so I kind of work across Montana and I also work virtually, which again was a very intentional decision for me 5 years ago to allow me to live where I want to live and be able to go fishing on a Friday afternoon and duck out and go ski every once in a while. That's 100%, a big part of how I want to build my life and how I want to help other people build the life that they want to be able to live. So yeah, BC is not a bad spot either. I spent some time in the Pacific Northwest and you're in the Pacific really Northwest. Beautiful part of
Southwest,
the world.
Pacific Southwest.
That's right. Touche.
All right, Dawson, man, thanks so much for laying out EOS for us. I really appreciate it. It's good to have you on the podcast. And for those who are interested in learning more about Dawson and EOS and all that stuff, links in the show notes. You can find more there. Thanks so much for listening all the way to the end of this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend you think may enjoy it too. You can also take a few seconds to subscribe to the podcast. Anything you do to help share the love here, we'd appreciate it. Thanks so much for following along, and we'll see you next time.